Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we are going to start learning about the plasma membrane, otherwise known as the cell membrane. You might be asking yourself, how does the cell membrane relate to what we've learned already? Well, if you recall in biochemistry, we learned about various organic compounds. Then we just recently finished our unit on the cell and cell division, where we focused on how the cell functions as a whole. Now we are going to be spending the next couple weeks over the next couple units focusing on an in-depth study and analysis of how each of the organelles that we've learned about so far work together and function and help the cell stay alive. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about with the cell membrane is a review of what the function of the cell membrane is. The cell membrane is considered to be a selectively permeable surface. This also means it's semi-permeable, both of which are defined as allowing certain substances into and out of the cell. If you remember back from our cells unit, we described the cell membrane as a security officer or a bodyguard. Your cell membrane allows only certain molecules that the cell needs into it and prohibits others from entering. For example, your cell will always allow oxygen to enter because that oxygen is used by the mitochondria to produce energy, but it will not let the oxygen out. If the cell does not need a substance, the cell membrane will prohibit it from entering, and if it needs to get rid of something, it will make sure to remove that thing as well. Now let's look at the composition of the cell membrane. If you recall back to biochemistry, we learned about lipids, and in particular phospholipids, and that their function is to make up the cell membrane. Well, the cell membrane is primarily composed of a phospholipid bilayer, two layers of phospholipids stacked on each other. And remember the monomers for a phospholipid: the phosphate group, which is the circle, the glycerol backbone, which is the rectangle, and then the two fatty acid chains that make up the tentacle-looking parts of the phospholipid. Um, the composition of the phospholipid bilayer is based upon two properties of the phosphate group and the fatty acids. The phosphate group is considered hydrophilic. It loves water, and the fatty acids are considered hydrophobic or water-fearing. And if you look at the arrangement of those phospholipids in the bilayer, the two things that don't like to be in an aqueous environment are in the inside of that membrane, and then on the outside are the parts that do like to be in contact with water. It may surprise you, but the cell membrane is not only made of phospholipids. There are lots of other things found floating in and around it. Therefore, the cell membrane is considered a fluid mosaic structure. What this means is that the cell membrane is fluid and that particles are moving in and around each other. It's not static. You will have proteins and phospholipids that scoot around as the cell moves and the organism moves. These phospholipids and proteins will move around and are not stuck or fixed in one position. The term mosaic and in the description that it's a fluid mosaic means that the cell membrane is made up of lots of molecules, primarily phospholipids, as you can see in the model, but you will also see scattered throughout those proteins. We're going to spend the next little bit focusing on what some of those other molecules are that are found in and around the phospholipids in the cell membrane. The very first thing we're going to talk about is cholesterol. If you recall, cholesterol is a type of steroid. It's another type of lipid, but the way that we use cholesterol in our cell membrane is to provide structure and support in strengthening of the cell membrane. The phospholipids can oftentimes have their fatty acids get tangled or stuck together because they're floating around in between. So scattered among scattered throughout and among those fatty acid chains are going to be these glycerols. They act as a lubricant to prevent the fatty acids from sticking and clumping together. This is also the compound that allows the cell membrane to move about and all those molecules to move around. And believe it or not, besides providing that lubrication, it also strengthens the cell membrane to make sure that it's stronger and more secure. The first protein we're going to look at is called a marker protein. Marker proteins are used by your cells as a recognition system. It acts very much like a flag or a sign to tell the rest of your body what type of cell it is and who it belongs to. Each cell has a slightly different marker protein on the outside of them, and every one of your cells have marker proteins that will communicate to the rest of your body and other pathogens that they belong to your body. If you look here on the right-hand side, the purple part that's embedded in the cell membrane is the actual protein, and then there's a carbohydrate that comes off from the top. The carbohydrate is the actual flag that changes slightly depending upon the type of cell and the person you are, and the purple protein down here on the bottom is equivalent to the flag pole. Certain viruses and or pathogens only attack specific cells like HIV attacking your white blood cells because they recognize the type of cell as a white blood cell and they don't recognize any other marker proteins. So they ignore everybody else and only go after white blood cells due to that flag, that marker protein that says, hey, I'm a white blood cell. The next protein we're going to talk about are enzymes. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions, just like we learned in biochemistry, and that applies to the enzymes that are found embedded throughout the cell membrane. Not every cell has enzymes, but sperm, for example, have lots of enzymes located on the very front of the cell membrane because they are required to break down the outside layer of the egg cell, which is relatively thick. If you look at that, if you look at that picture on the bottom left, and they have to break through that outer layer of the egg cell in order to access the nucleus and actually fertilize the cell. So the better the enzymes, the faster they work, and the more of them that are located on the cell membrane, the faster that sperm is able to penetrate the egg cell and fertilize it. The last type of protein that we're going to learn about are called transport proteins. Some of these transport proteins are also called channel proteins because they have an opening in the center that allows them to facilitate the movement of large molecules from one side of the membrane to the other. They oftentimes look like a cross-section of an olive, and they have the protein on the outside with an opening down the middle. That opening or channel acts very much like a bridge or a tunnel for transportation of molecules into or out of the cell, depending upon what the cell membrane and the cell requires. Now that we've learned about the cell membrane, I want you guys to answer the following questions to check your understanding about the cell membrane and its job. Go ahead and flip your paper over. You're going to need a couple different coloring utensils, and we are going to identify the various parts of the cell membrane on the back of your piece of paper. Let's start with item A. Item A on your key is labeled the lipid bilayer. On the right-hand side of your image, you will notice that there is a little bracket labeled A. You're going to color that a light pink or light purple color to indicate that this whole thing within the entire bracket is the lipid bilayer. Next, you're going to go ahead and you're going to color part B. B is labeled the phospholipids. If you look at your image, that's going to be all of the phosphate groups. So go ahead and color all of the circles on the bottom and the top that indicate the phospholipids. I want you to color all of those green. Don't worry about coloring within the lines. You can color outside the lines. Just shade it all in to indicate that that whole area is covered by phospholipids. Next, we're going to color part C. Part C is down here on the insert at the bottom left, and it's the bracket indicating that the phosphate group portion of your phospholipid is hydrophilic, and that's because it is the polar region of the molecule. Now we're going to go ahead and color the fatty acids, or the hydrophobic part of the phospholipid. That you can color the entire middle portion between your phosphate groups that you colored green. You can color all of that portion orange to indicate that that's where the fatty acids are, as well as on the inset in the very bottom corner. Now let's move on to part E. E on our key is labeled cholesterol. If you notice in the insert on the left-hand side, there's something that kind of looks like a small balloon or sperm cell. That is not a sperm cell, it's not a balloon, that is actually representing the cholesterol. Go ahead and color that red. Then if you look up at your actual cell membrane, the larger picture of it, scattered throughout, there are going to be 4 different cholesterol molecules, one in each part in between each of those large proteins scattered throughout the cell membrane. Go ahead and color those 4 red as well. Next comes the channel protein. Channel proteins, we're going to color them dark blue. There are 6 of them scattered throughout the cell membrane. The easiest ones to identify are labeled F, like the one right in the middle of the cell membrane that kind of looks like a pitted olive. Then there's one right to the right of it that has part of it cut off, and it looks flat on the one side. You can tell that this is a channel protein because there are a couple lines that run down the middle that make it look like there's a divot or a channel running through it. There's one right in the back between those 2 molecules. And then there are 3 to the left. The one that you can see the entire side, and then there are 2 right below it. The next protein we're going to look at and identify is the enzyme. There is one enzyme present here on our cell membrane. It is labeled G. It's peeking out on the bottom side of the cell membrane, and it kind of looks like the flower spitty thing from Mario, the one that spits the lava. You can tell that it's an enzyme because there is an active site. That's the little ring represented on the bottom. Any enzyme will have that unique active site present on there, making it easy enough to identify as an enzyme versus a channel protein or a marker protein. The last 2 things we're going to label and color on our cell membrane are the marker proteins and the carbohydrates. We're going to color all of them purple. The marker proteins are the entire molecule that contains both the protein and the carbohydrate flag sticking off the top of it. So color the 4 molecules that have those carbohydrates on top of them. Color the whole thing purple, representing that that is the marker protein, or like we talked about earlier, the flag.